Christine,
Yes.
I know you already need to know how many people are attending the webinar. Currently, I'm sitting with colleagues from the CRSN. We are 8 of us sitting in the same room.
Okay, great, Ali. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And we are online. There are 22 people online at the moment, and still some joining.
Hello, welcome to the webinar, everyone. Great, let's give people one more minute to join. While you're here, can you please add your name and your affiliation to the chat box to introduce yourself? Thank you. Hi, Claudia.
See, we're still having a couple of people joining in last minute.
Yeah.
All right.
Great,
Shall
so
we
should we
start?
get started?
Okay. All right,
Fantastic.
welcome everyone to this exciting webinar as part of a project sponsored by the European Space Agency and Future Earth. This project is focusing on advancing planetary epidemiology through Earth observations. It's part of the activities around the European Space Agency to engage with researchers from various topics to work on the various databases and resources that the European Space Agency is providing. Just as a real quick overview of what we're hoping to discuss with you today, I'll introduce you on the various speakers after this, but first just to give you a sense of the blocks of talks that will be happening. We'll have a few welcome and introductions, followed by developments in Earth observations data. Then we'll introduce some of the research that's happening at the Future Earth Health Knowledge Action Network. And we'll have a break in a little less than an hour from now. And then my colleague, Sophie Hebden, will be taking over to chair the rest of the meeting on the pilot project on child health, climate, and land system change in sub-Saharan Africa. But also developments in further developments in Earth observations, and we'll have a more focused opportunity for everybody to provide inputs, but also to raise questions or comments in a Q&A at the end of today's talk. So just as a reminder, anybody that's joining in late, we really appreciate if you could put your name and affiliation in the chat. You can also do so by updating your name in the participants list by adding your affiliation in. This is so that we can keep track of who's participating in case we want to follow up. So first up, we'll have the introduction slides by my colleague Sophie Hebden, who's based at the European Space Agency and is also seconded to Future Earth, and she will introduce you on the Future Earth European Space Agency joint program. Sophie, the floor is yours. And you'll have to unmute.
Thank you. Sorry, I had to stop the screen share then to do that. So I'll just quickly go into the European Space Agency, and Gilles, you'll be talking about Future Earth. So yes, so the European Space Agency is 22 member states funding it. mainly European states. It's distributed across Europe on 8 sites and employs several thousand staff. The budget is about 7 billion euros in 2023. And as you're probably very much aware, it's about mission development for satellite Earth observation. But there's all sorts of other areas that ESA's designing and funding research, science research. And one of those ways is through the Future Earth programme. So the ESA missions in space go back to the sort of ENVISAT era. So in this diagram, you can see on the left side the science missions. So you can see that we have Earth Explorer missions that are in space, finished being in space, and being planned to be launched into space. The middle band there is the Sentinel missions, which is really driving a huge step change in the use of Earth observation for all manner of research and commercial activities, particularly around climate and monitoring of the environment. The Sentinel-2 and Sentinel-1 in particular, just providing an amazing amount of data. And then on the the orange side, the far right side, that's the meteorological satellites, which inform the numerical weather prediction. So yeah, I just mentioned there's a huge revolution in the amount of data available, and that's one of the topics that we're going to be discussing at this webinar, how to make use of this for health research. And so the Future Earth Joint Programme is supporting work on using Earth observation for research that Future Earth networks are carrying out. And this webinar is basically on the Health Knowledge Action Network of Future Earth, and it's covering some of the research that's being carried out in a pilot study. So the point of the joint programme is to identify research priorities and set the research agenda, and support studies that bring the data sets together for decision making. And there's also a small fund for travel support. So I just want to make that aware for participants here. If you want to come to ESA meetings, then please visit the Joint Future Earth ESA programme website, which is from the Future Earth website. I'll put the link in the chat box to apply for travel support. That's me, and I think I'll move on for Gilles to screen share.
Thank you, Sophie, for a great introduction on the European Space Agency and Future Earth Joint Programme. And you also nicely already mentioned the Future Health Knowledge Action Network, which is one of the 27 global research networks of Future Earth. The reason why we're bringing this here is because this project was accepted as part of a joint project between the organizations, but also that the Health Knowledge Action Network does have a research agenda where this work also fits in really nicely. Just to give a little bit of background myself, my name is Gilles Sioun. I'm based at the Global Future Earth Secretariat in Japan, and I co-lead the research and innovation work of the organization. And I'm also based at the National Institute for Environmental Studies in Japan. I think many of you are very much aware why we are doing this line of work, and I think the people that are in the room that have familiarity with Earth observations know a lot about the trends that are happening. And it's really an exciting opportunity to look at what some of these effects are, not only on the natural sciences, but also on, for example, health or other kinds of observations we can make that are related to health and planetary health at large. Future Earth itself has quite a strong backbone. You can see the custodian organizations, which is UNESCO, UNEP, the International Science Council, and Development Forum. They advise us, but also we can leverage, of course, their networks and reputation in our work. We have various partner organizations. This is mainly within the science policy arena, but also other networks that are doing like-minded work that bring in very specific expertise. And of course, we have a large range of funders that are on board that support our global secretariat services from various offices around the world. Just to give you a brief overview, we have 9 global secretariat hubs. They're based in the US, Canada, France, Sweden, China, South Asia, Taipei, and Japan. There are also various national and local networks or committees, and really deep diving into the research work. We have 27 networks. Each of them may have a number of around 1,000 or more experts that are connected within their networks to do various research related activities. I've mentioned the Health Knowledge Action Network is one of 27 global research networks. Just very briefly giving you an overview of the other networks that we work with. And there are opportunities to connect with these along the way also for this project. The Health Knowledge Action Network particularly focuses on solution-driven transdisciplinary research and action, everything related to both human health, including the broader human well-being health, but also planetary health at large, where human health is part of. And we do that to engage with various communities or other research communities and build capacity to generate, share, and apply knowledge. I want to also tribute the steering committee of this network, of which we will have 2 speakers in a moment contributing their work for the advancement of this project, and our beloved advisory group that is regularly advising on various strategic endeavors, but also opportunities for the network at large. The Health Knowledge Action Network was launched really actively back in 2019. This is just a little overview picture of some of the members that managed to take part in person. But why I'm showing this picture is because this group, together with a wider range of participants online, developed the Health Knowledge Action Network research agenda on transdisciplinary research priorities, where they looked at what the various processes are that are affecting both human and environmental health. They've categorized these into socioeconomic transitions and global environmental changes, which then feeds into a research agenda where, of course, related to ESA is that monitoring, surveillance, and learning through Earth observations, but also to strengthen climate resilient health systems, and identifying risks and finding ways to manage those risks and communicating them clearly is really essential for planetary health. And I'll leave it at that, other than you're always welcome to join the Future Earth family if you have not yet. We look forward to the next parts of this exciting webinar. And next, I would like to bring to the floor or offer the floor to Dr. Christine Belesova from the Imperial College London, who's going to introduce planetary epidemiology.
Thank you very much, Jill, and thank you very much, Sophie, for the introduction. Jill, may I just check that you can see my presentation full screen?
You're going to have to swap displays.
Thanks.
Perfect.
So thank you very much for the introductions. So the webinar is really starting with the words planetary epidemiology. It's not maybe the term that you hear the most these days. I imagine a lot of you would have heard the term planetary health, which is the health of human civilizations and the natural systems on which it depends. And to remind you, planetary health is very much concerned with the global environmental changes, which you can see here on the slide. And there have been planetary boundaries defined for each one of these dimensions. And a lot of these changes are very much interacting with human health, be it non-communicable diseases, infectious diseases, malnutrition, or mental health. But then why do we need the term planetary epidemiology? Normally, we hear the term environmental epidemiology, which is the study of the effect on human health of various physiological, biological, physical, biological, chemical factors in the external environment. So environmental epidemiology was usually about a factor that has a defined exposure, or you can produce a defined exposure, and then it relates that exposure to human health using statistical methods or other quantitative methods. Now, when we're talking about planetary epidemiology, we're talking about multiple global environmental changes that are complex in themselves, but there's also a number of them, and they are affecting human health and the health of other species in a multiplicative way. And also these changes affect the natural resources on which human health and well-being depends. And so does depend the health and well-being of other species. And often humans versus other species also compete for resources. These days, we can see that humans are actually consuming a disproportionate amount of resources across all sorts and kind. And here on the diagram on the right, you can see a summary of the different environmental changes that we're experiencing. And you can see that the way how these changes are affecting health can be broadly classified into direct health effects, into ecosystem-mediated health effects, and indirect, deferred, and displaced health effects. So the direct health effects is something that environmental epidemiology has already been addressing, and with a reasonable success. Ecosystem-mediated health effects, so you can see some environmental epidemiology studies addressing that, especially in infectious disease area, which is quite well developed in relation to environmental factors. But others perhaps less so. So mental health area is still under development. And of course, the indirect and deferred and displaced health effects are much more complicated and difficult to study using traditional environmental epidemiology methods. And to illustrate, so when we're talking about planetary epidemiology, we can think back to the planetary boundaries. And every planetary boundary has multiple pathways how it affects human health, and usually there are multiple health effects impacted. But then you can also look at it from the other perspective, that every health impact has multiple pathways of how it is being affected by multiple boundaries. So we have this two-way multiplicity going on here. And of course, when we have it all together, we also need to consider the fact that each pathway, how every planetary boundary is affecting human health, is very much shaped by humans, by our decisions and actions. So it's kind of down to us for the way how we're affecting our health eventually. Planetary health and planetary epidemiology are fields that absolutely recognize that humans are responsible for many global environmental changes today. And so in planetary epidemiology, we're also talking about the concepts such as co-benefits of climate change mitigation and adaptation, etc. So we are very conscious of the fact that there are actions that we can take to mitigate global environmental changes and at the same time improve human health. And so this picture kind of shows you, don't go into detail looking at it, but it shows you how complex these processes are. And at every step, there are feedbacks and interactions that have consequences for human health. So the question now is, if we're talking about planetary epidemiology, we are unavoidably talking about complex systems, we're talking about interactions, and what we definitely need are new methodological approaches to study the health impacts using planetary epidemiology methods. So what are those? And I invite you in the chat box, enter any ideas about planetary epidemiology methods that you're using in your work that you have heard of, or perhaps you would like to be developed. And of course, as you've seen from the title and description of this webinar here, we're talking about the Earth observation data and how it can be linked to human health data to advance the field of planetary epidemiology. And so we'll be talking about that more in the subsequent talks and throughout the webinar. So thank you. That's all from me for now.
Thank you for a really informative overview on planetary epidemiology. I think that's helpful for many people in the room. So that concludes our welcome and introductions. Now we'd like to dip a little bit deeper into the content of the work. So I'd like to introduce Clément Mathieu Jacques Albergel from the European Space Agency to give his overview on the recent developments in Earth observation data. The floor is yours.
Thank
Clément.
you. Thank you very much. Could you please confirm that you see my screen?
Yeah, perfect.
Thank you very much. So, right. I'm Clément Albergel from the European Space Agency, and my main line of activity focuses on ESA's climate program, the climate change initiative that we implement at the Climate Office under the Directorate of the Earth Observation Program of ESA. This talk is for me the opportunity to give you an overview of the climate change initiative of ESA, its rationale, and some of the data sets we produce, and also briefly how they can be used in a specific case for epidemiology. And this case demonstrates how satellite Earth observation can be used in combination with machine learning to develop activity in planetary epidemiology. But first, some background. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, is leading the international effort to combat climate change and keep global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius, as set out in the Paris Agreement for Climate. And it is intending to do so mostly through 3 actions: mitigation of greenhouse gas emission, building resilience and adaptation, and finance flows to help developing countries to adapt to climate change and to mitigate their emissions. National governments have made commitments under the UNFCCC Paris Agreement through what we call nationally determined contributions, NDCs, addressing those 3 areas. And progress will be assessed in a 5-yearly global stocktake, starting this year in 2023, to assess the common project towards addressing the common goal of the Paris Agreement for Climate. Now, satellite data will be essential to enable national government to effectively design, monitor, and verify the commitment under the UNFCCC Paris Agreement. Coming back to climate, to better understand this system and its variability, the UNFCCC needs observations. They have delegated to the GCOS, the Global Climate Observing System, a public consultation to define the variables that represent climate best. GCOS has defined a list of 55 essential climate variables, ECVs. More than half of them, 2/3 actually, can benefit from satellite Earth observation. And as a direct response to the UNFCCC needs in observation, ESA has launched its climate program, the Climate Change Initiative, more than a decade ago. The CCI is a coordinated research and development program amongst ESA member states that main objective is to generate robust, long-term, global satellite-derived data sets for key indicators of climate change, the essential climate variable. And we do that by putting together, by harnessing 40 years of ESA Earth observation archives and combining them with data from both third-party and current mission. The ECVs we produce can be used to guide mitigation and adaptation measures, to assess climate risks, to attribute climatic events to underlying causes, and to support climate services. Climate modelers can use ECVs to study drivers, interactions and feedback due to climate change, as well as teleconnection, tipping point, and fluxes of energy, water, and carbon, as well as to predict future changes. On this slide, you have an example from the Soil Moisture CCI project that has been putting together data from 17 sensors in space to develop an harmonized time series of surface soil moisture spanning from 1979 to 2022 and going forwards under an operational climate service, the Copernicus Climate Change Service, C3S. We also look at land cover and land cover changes, and that's because having an accurate estimate of land use and land cover change is crucial to support the global stocktake process, because the role for land for storing carbon and its future potential for offsetting carbon emission is huge and is an area of active research. And modeling the interactions between vegetation, climate, and greenhouse gases is supported by data sets such as those from the moderate and high-resolution CCI land cover project to quantify changes consistently across countries. And I've seen in the chat that we have some representatives from those consortium, so that's great to have them on board. The moderate resolution land cover project has a unique series of annual consistent land cover maps at 300 meters spatial resolution spanning from 1992 to current time. The high resolution land cover is developing static maps for 3 areas in the Sahel, the Amazon, and Siberia at 10 meters spatial resolution, along with long-term record of regional maps at 300 meters spatial resolution in the sub-region every 5 years, and information about changes every year. Each of those 3 zones, it's not yet a global product, has been identified as they correspond to a specific need from the scientific community. And on the illustration, on the bottom left side of the slide, you can see a map from the high-resolution land cover product over the Amazon. That's the right panel that is produced by fusing information from Sentinel-2. You have an image in the middle panel, also with Sentinel-1 images at 10 meters spatial resolution. So the moderate resolution land cover product is shown on the left panel for comparison. And as you can see, new details in the high-resolution land cover map appears. You can see tributaries to the main river and urban area classes that are omitted at coastal scale spatial resolution. We also have a focus on fire, and that's because vegetation on land, when disturbed by wildfire, has a potential to release significant greenhouse gas and particulate matter into the atmosphere. And this smoke, this emission, can also be useful in the context. This information can also be useful in the context of epidemiological studies. It is estimated that about 25 to 35% of greenhouse gas result from biomass burning, and therefore they are considered an important factor in climate change. The Fire CCI project focuses on the key variable burn area using a hybrid approach combining surface reflectance, the light that is emitted by the surface, and thermal anomaly. Fire CCI has different products at global scale and different spatial resolution derived from left to right from MODIS, Sentinel-3, AVHRR, but has also recently focused on high resolution at regional scale, Africa, using sub-Saharan Africa, using Sentinel-2 information at 20 meters spatial resolution to develop a small fire database covering for now 2 years, 2016 and 2019. On this slide, you have at the top an illustration for one single location in Austral Africa with burn area at different spatial resolution from MODIS, Sentinel-3, and Sentinel-2. MODIS will be about 250 meters spatial resolution, Sentinel-2, 20 meter spatial resolution. And you can see that thanks to the higher spatial resolution, we can detect well more burn area. We significantly improve total burn area detection at high resolution. And when we constrain models such as fire emission models, the global fire emission dataset with higher resolution burn area, the impact in terms of fire emission is huge as well. And we can compare that to observation from the Tropomi sensor that measure CO emission, a measure of fire emission. And for Austral Africa, in this case, we can see that using high resolution burn area in a fire emission model, we need to have much realistic fire emission. And given the impact that biomass burning aerosol have on the energy budget of the planet, this could turn to improve weather forecast and consequently better skill in downstream application that relies on it. We also look at land surface temperature. Land surface temperature is an important variable within the Earth's climate system, describing processes such as exchange of energy, water between the land surface and the atmosphere, and it influences the rate and timing of plant growth. Accurately understanding land surface temperature at global and regional level helps to better understand land surface atmosphere exchanges processes in models And when combined with other physical properties, such as vegetation and soil moisture, it provides a valuable metric of surface state. The land surface temperature climate data record reproduce is the most up-to-date observation of such variables, and they can be used to gain a more comprehensive understanding of environmental changes. We have this data set presented here, spanning the last 25 years, and the records show a stable increase in land surface temperature of about 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade, although there is considerable regional variability within this. Before ending this talk, I also wanted to give you an example where our data have been used in combination with machine learning to detect cholera outbreak. This study was led by Amy Campbell during a one-year-long graduate traineeship with us at the Climate Office. And she has used a machine learning algorithm, a random forest classifier that allowed to recognize patterns across long data set and make testable predictions. Her algorithm was trained on disease outbreak reported in coastal district in India between 2010 and 2018, and was able to learn the relationship with 6 satellite-based climate records we have developed. If I remember correctly, sea surface temperature and salinity, sea level, ocean color, surface soil moisture, and land surface temperature. And this algorithm was able to correctly identify about 90% of cholera outbreak. And it is a very good example of how long-term climate data record based on satellite Earth observation can be used in relation with human health. And there is also this very advertised example, perhaps not directly linked to climate, but I wanted to show it to you. It is linked to air quality. As we all know, in order to curb the spread of COVID-19 outbreak, countries across the world have implemented strict measures, placing cities and even entire countries on lockdown. Scientists from KNMI have been using data from Copernicus Sentinel-5P satellites to monitor both weather and pollution over Europe. And those two images, flashing in front of you, clearly illustrate a strong reduction of nitrogen dioxide concentration over major cities across Europe, specifically Milan, Paris, and Madrid. If you follow the link below this illustration, you will have similar story across the world. And I think that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much for having me, and looking forward to interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clément, for a really impressive overview of the recent advancements in Earth observations. And I'm also happy to learn about the fruitful outcomes of several of these projects. We're running slightly over time, so instead of having a little bit of time for a follow-up question, we're going to jump right into the next talk. So I'd like to introduce Professor Andine Chiho Watanabe from the Nagasaki University, who's also a Health Knowledge Action Network steering committee member, who will give an overview of his ongoing work. Professor, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Joe. And I'm Chiho Watanabe, and I'll talk about assessing the individual exposure to heat in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And I think that most of the people will talk about the very large scale or maybe the planetary scale, but my talk will be focusing on the more micro scale, and this study has been conducted maybe 6 or 7 years back, and so relatively old study. And I wonder after that what kind of the progress has been made, especially from the Earth observation techniques. And I learned, very pleased to learn that ESA has been making a great progress in observing the Earth system. And okay. So I can skip this one, and because Jill already introduced this, and from the launching of the health scan, and we are recognizing the importance of the monitoring and the surveillance, and particularly using the satellites and other stuff. And planetary epidemiology, if it its aim to be a breakthrough apparatus in the multi-exposure issues, I think that there's some issues that should be addressed. And I would like, in this talk, I would like to focusing on the issue of the mobility of the people and the issue of the chemical exposure, and which might not be the center focus of this talk. But anyway, I think one important point is environmental epidemiology, and to what extent it would like to cover various exposures. And I think that there's many exposures, including the physical and the chemical and of course biological. But I think that these combinedly affect our health, and also not only our health, but also the health of the animals and plants. So I think that it depends on what is your aim. So that's a very important point. So for that, the choice of the environmental factors and health outcomes is very crucial, even if you are doing the very explorative research. And that's one point. And also aligning Earth observation with the ground observation and the other data is also very important. And especially if you work with health data, particularly the developing countries, not so much elaborated. So you have a very hard time to find the appropriate data, or sometimes you need to find the data by yourself. You need to collect the data by yourself. So I think that I will tell something about the mobility of the people. And mobility issues is actually the question is, what is a heat exposure? In this case, I'm focusing on the heat exposure. And what is a heat exposure for the individuals? Of course, then you can define the heat exposure from the satellites, and by using the LSD that has been already introduced by the previous speaker. But if you define the heat exposure from the individual site, it may appear differently. And usually, the heat exposure is estimated based on the residential area's temperature. It's regardless of the using the ground data or the satellite observed data. But in the area, especially in the urban area, many people living in the surrounding areas are commuting to the center of the urban area. So that makes the heat level to which they're exposed to different. So question is, to what extent this kind of the daily trips or daily commute will change the level of the heat exposure? That was our question to this local study. And so in this case, we are focusing on the Bangladesh, Dhaka, and Dhaka is the capital of the Bangladesh. And we use land surface temperature data from the MODIS. And also we just reconstruct the people's daily trip. One study, daily trip data is obtained by the questionnaire, and the other study, daily trip data is reconstructed from the core detailed records of the mobile phones. So this is just showing how even within the urban area, one city, you have very wide variation of the heat exposure. And so in the daytime or nighttime, you have this kind of difference in the land surface temperature. And this kind of difference actually speaks some in terms of the health, because in the left down side, it is said in the Paris heat wave events, even the 0.5 degree difference in the nighttime land surface temperature was significant in terms of the deaths. So this is just showing the urban heat island formation in the Dhaka, and it's the average land surface temperature of the April 2009. And in the left map, you can see the Dhaka metropolitan area. This is the urban area, we defined it, and the surrounding area is defined as a suburb area. So some people are just living and moving within urban area. Others are just staying in the suburb area, but some are commuting from outside to inside, or the oppositely inside to outside. So then we are focusing on the how this kind of movements make a difference when we evaluate the heat exposure of these residents. And this is the result. And we have two models, dynamic and static. And the static models are just a conventional epidemiology model in which we estimate the heat exposure based on the residential area's temperature. And but the dynamic model, we take the commuting activity into account. And so that we just follow the movement of the participants, and also the considering the areal difference of the surface temperature. And we classified the people into four. And some people are staying in urban, others are staying in the commute and suburb, and others are commuting from inside to outside and outside and inside. And as easily expected, when we consider the commuting, the heat exposure level was different. And similar study we have done a similar study using the phone call records, and we obtained a similar result. So this is one thing. Another thing is the issue of the multiple exposure to chemicals, and this multiple exposure is a long-lasting headache for the toxicologist. And there's some big project using the concept of the exposome. Exposome is a comprehensive evaluation of the multiple exposure to the multiple chemicals. And there, I just pick up the two big projects. One is Athlete, and which is conducted in the European countries and funded by the Horizon 2020, involving 12 countries, including the United States, and covering more than 80,000 pairs of the mother and the children. And another one is JEX, Japan Environmental Children's Study. It is funded by the Japanese government, covering 100,000 pairs of the mother and the children. And their main aim is evaluates the impact of the exposure to the chemical pollutants, and especially in the earlier life, starting from the fetal period to the adolescent period. And but in this, all this project has a problem, not a problem, but a barrier to overcome. And one barrier is there's many agents actually. It is said over 2,000 to 12,000 chemicals are there in this environment, and their conversion was a very limited number of the health outcomes. And I think that if you are thinking about the climate change and the biodiversity loss and other things, there are also conversion of this same number of the outcomes. So I think the mode of interaction is very important, as already pointed out by the Christine. And I think that we need to think about how each of numerous agents interact with each other. And also we need to think about the modifying factor for the biology side. And we need to consider the genetics, epigenetics, physiology, nutrition, and gut microflora, acclimatization, blah, blah, blah. So these are also the headache. But I think that by using this planetary epidemiology approaches and using some AI or the other techniques, maybe we can find or we can establish new way to make the breakthrough of this. So actually, I would like to emphasize that in the planetary boundaries, there's one boundary which is called as novel entities, and novel entity is actually almost equal to the many bunch of the chemicals. And there's some argument which is discussed in the paper published in last year. And this planetary boundary for the novel entities might be already transgressed. And this is not based on the something like the planetary boundary for the biodiversity or the some of the chemical elements like the nitrogen and phosphorus, and which is actually based on some natural scientific evidence. But in this case, the novel entity's planetary boundary has been transgressed. It's based on the fact that the production and the release of these chemicals are far exceeding the capacity of the human monitoring and controlling these chemicals. So I think that this way of thinking is maybe very important when you think about the planetary epidemiology. So just this is just summarizing up, and I think the mobility issue has some hint for how to combine the various kind of the observations, and also the multiple exposure issues, multiple exposure to the chemical issues is probably another headache for the planetary epidemiology. Thank you.
Thank you for another exciting talk, and I hope you will not need any medicine for the headaches that this research is causing. So thank you so much, and I think this also outlines the need to really clarify all the assumptions within every study, and of course ground truthing and so forth is also essential. Without further ado, I'd like to very quickly bring forward Professor Morse, Andy Morse from the University of Liverpool, who's also a Health Knowledge Action Network Steering Committee member. Professor, the floor is yours.
Hello, can you hear me okay? I'm not...
Perfect.
Yeah, you can hear. Hold on.
Although we're getting a different screen now.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we hear you well.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know if I'd unmuted or not. Okay. So thanks for the introduction, Gilles. So my background is in atmospheric physics, but for about 30 years now, I've been looking at the impacts of climate on particularly vector-borne diseases, mostly of humans, but also of animals. I'm also part of Future Earth, working with the health can, as Gilles has already introduced. So it's a cartoon, but it's very serious. I think I probably started to do this work when we were on Fine-ish, and I've been through, been through the we reached the oh no, and this year with unprecedented indicators in the Earth climate system, at least from observations of the atmosphere and the ocean, we're some way towards doom. And I think this really emphasizes the urgency of the problem that we have in terms of understanding the impacts of climate change on the whole Earth system. So in terms of data, we always use gridded data on the whole rather than point data. So we start off using reanalysis. Typically now it would be ERA 5 reanalysis. And we often actually already use Earth observation by replacing sometimes the reanalysis rainfall estimation with a satellite rainfall estimation. Typically, we work on extended, which is out to 42 days, and seasonal scales out to 7 months, because the biological systems that we model take some time to wind up and obviously develop. We have also worked at climate change timescales as well, looking at projections. So generally, we're using multiple model runs, ensemble prediction systems for the seasonal, sub-seasonal to seasonal scale, and then multiple climate models. So we're sort of used to using lots of data. In terms of the disease and also the vector models, as you'll see in a moment, the arthropods, insects and arachnids that spread the disease, then there are different levels of approach. It's very simple climate envelope model approaches. And what I'm going to show here is an intermediate approach, which is a thermally driven, compartmental, susceptible, exposed, infected and recovered status with a daily time step. We can go further and we can use ordinary differential equations to solve all the model equations at each time step, or we can use other approaches as well. So we prefer working with dynamic models, and they are climate-driven data. Worked on every time I hit my mouse, sorry. I worked on a range of diseases, and I won't read them all out. We've worked in different parts of the world, but very much focused on the whole in Africa and India, and then in Southeast Asia. Well, I will point out there's no real subdiscipline combining climate and health, or meteorology and health, whereas we have well-established subdisciplines or whole disciplines in hydrometeorology and agrometeorology, which have been going for over 100 years. So what do we need to create a vector-borne disease? Several things have to come together, and I'm hesitant to use the pointer on my mouse, but here we go. We need the host, so that's the animal that's becoming infected, and the vector, the other animal that brings the disease. So normally there's something that bites you and sucks your blood, and mosquitoes are a very good example for the spread of malaria. We also need to have the environment, and particularly the climate, that's correct for enabling the vector, but also the host to survive. And finally, we need the pathogen either already endemic in the area or introduced. So different pathogens for different diseases can be parasites, can be bacteria, can be viruses. Okay. So we are in the world of prediction. We are looking at taking seasonal forecasts. Here is a plume for the El Nino event that's currently already occurring and will peak in December or so. And we take the outputs from the seasonal forecasts for each grid point that we're interested in, and generally we're running the models with a daily temperature and the daily rainfall data. So here's an example of a Liverpool malaria model, and from this we've derived other models. This is something of what I was describing as, I think, intermediate complexity. There's no real fancy maths in here. All the functions are empirical and have to be sometimes derived. But what we have, just quickly, is that we have the life stages of the mosquito, and then the adult mosquitoes can be susceptible. If they bite an infected human, they pick up malaria or malaria parasite. They're exposed, but there's a latency period here. Then they become infectious if they survive this long. And then when they bite a susceptible human, that human will become exposed and lead on to infectious. And there is actually a natural recovery if the human doesn't die. Okay, let's try and summarize. So we can model climate variability driven vector-borne diseases over a number of different diseases using different climate model outputs combined in some cases with Earth observation. And we can show a skill in that forecast. We are very close to operationalizing what we're doing in the current project in the Greater Horn of Africa. That is our aim, to produce an operational system. Obviously, there's quite a difference between working at an R&D level and then working at an operational level. I've already mentioned the use of rainfall estimation. These days it's going to be chirps, but where else could we use Earth observations? So one of the things that I've wanted to do for a long time is to use the higher spatial resolutions that are available through Earth observation compared to climate model data grids or forecast grids, and to set up a series of initial conditions for the forecast at subgrid scales and probably at 1 kilometre or less. And we can talk more about that later on maybe. The other thing is that all data sets have biases in, and we're using what the model says is a 2 metre air temperature for the temperatures. But obviously what we really want is the habitat temperatures where let's say the mosquitoes are living. And this is something that we might be able to get better through EO and maybe able to bias correct and validate the temperatures you're using. Also surface water presence of breeding sites and the temperatures of the water, but probably at a less than 5 metre scale. I would actually say 2 metre scale for Anopheles mosquitoes that bring malaria. So that's right probably at the edge of what Earth observations could do. There are other factors as well in terms of disease, maybe more generally. Areas of flooding are important. Historically, habitat types have been derived through NDVI, and many of the originators, and in fact the group that I started to work with originally were using NDVI before we moved on to seasonal forecasting. We've always seen presented this morning maybe the Easter land cover data set for the Horn of Africa, or the bit in East Africa at least that they've got, would be very interesting. And then assortment of things, settlements and human migration is important for disease, perhaps near surface airflow patterns over land, which I don't think we can do. And then really starting to look more and more at the uses of AI and machine learning now, but also thinking ahead to the 5th paradigm of science that I think will occur rather rapidly, partly through quantum computing, where we have cognitive computing systems. So thanks for listening, and I'll leave it there now.
Thank you so much, Professor Morse, for another really exciting and helpful input from your work to this project. So that concludes the speakers for the first part of the webinar. We recognize that it is quite challenging to keep focused for such a long extended period of time. We were going to have a 10 minutes break, but because we were running a bit out of time, and we still want to give you the privilege of the break, we're going to give you 2 minutes break. Please take this time to stretch your legs, close your eyes, sit back, and we'll reconvene with my colleague Sophie, who will be moderating at 59 past the hour.
Hello. Is everyone feeling slightly more refreshed now? Welcome back to the webinar. So let's go into the second half of the webinar now. If you're online, Ali, can you switch your camera on?
Est-ce que j'ai la caméra qui marche d'abord?
Thank you. So I'd like to introduce Alice from the Centre de Recherche
À l'ère de calendrier FDN,
en Son de Nuna, and Ali will be giving some background to the setting where Christine's pilot study is located. So please, Ali, I'll give the floor to you.
Thank you very much. I hope you are seeing my slides. Thank you for the organizer of this webinar for inviting me to share some information on what we are doing here in Nuna in Burkina Faso. Ali, here from the Centre de Recherche en Santé de Nuna, which is in English is Nuna Health Research Center, which is a center belonging to the National Institute of Public Health in Burkina Faso here. So I'm very happy with this webinar, since it's like talking about the planetary epidemiology, bringing the sophisticated tools, Earth observation, satellite, and others to link with the ground information where we are really talking. So I will be talking about the health and demographic surveillance system, which we can call like...
Sorry to interrupt you. Ali, we can't see your slides. Are you sharing them, or do you want me to share the backup?
Oh, sorry. Let
You
me
need to
check.
share your screen. It hasn't been shared.
Okay. Let me... Hein? On voit pas la présentation. So let me start again. We will be sharing. Okay, là. Au milieu des milieux. And now, can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can see that. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so I was saying that I'm very happy to... okay. To be part of this webinar, bringing so the tools that we are using here, which is the health and demographic surveillance system, what we call a community lab. It's like a laboratory where we are dealing with community here in Nuna. As a background, you can see this is Burkina Faso, the map of Burkina Faso, where you have in red, this is the Nuna district in the northwest part of the country. And in the southern part of the district, this is where we have our health and demographic surveillance system. So climate change is no matter to demonstrate, is that become really a big matter since the 1970s. And it's a global issue, but affected most the poor countries like Burkina Faso. We are a poor country, landlocked one, with annual rainfall ranging from 500 to 1,000 millimeter. And the mean and max temperature, the average range from 20 to 40. So this is the average of the temperatures. So the data of Nuna Health and Demographic Surveillance System shows that we have alternating flooding, drought, and heat wave over years that are all prejudicial for food security and health issues. And currently in 2023, Burkina Faso has more than 2 million people facing food crisis, which is almost 10% of the entire population of the country, which is really a lot. So to come back to the health and demographic surveillance system, I would like to introduce you the general concept of that. It's a community lab, meaning that it's a community, a well-defined geographical area with a well-defined population. We always start with a baseline census to get information on the setting, household, the people living there, and we have a unique identifier of the household and the individual living in the city. From there, we built what we call the population cohort that will be followed up over years. And this cohort will increase by in-migration and birth, those who are getting new in the cohort. And the cohort decrease with the out-migration and the deaths. So in Nuna, HDSS is established in 1992, which is like 30 years from now. We have 125,000 habitants that are under surveillance, spread out of 15,000 households. The area is served by 1 hospital and 17 health posts. So for the different update round, we have event monitoring, where we collect data on marriage, pregnancies, birth, death, in and out migration, and on all the deaths that occur in the area, we perform the verbal autopsy to ascertain the cause of the death. We also collect some data on health variable like the bednet ownership, utilization. We collect data on immunization for the children under 5, and also the nutritional status for the children. This is new for us to collect data on education. This fits the need of the Ministry of Education that needs this data, and we found it very useful to link the education data to the health data. We have also a household survey, which is a panel done out of 10% of the entire HDSS, where we try to monitor the socio-economic status of the household and also the asset of the household. How much a household in, how much they spend, and mostly we focus on how much is spent for health issues. We collect also data on morbidity, acute and chronic diseases, and focus on health-seeking behavior. On top of that, we have a local weather station in Nuna HDSS. We have 10 classical med stations. And now, since 2020, we have 5 new generation meteorological stations to collect met data and try to link them with the health and death data. So these are a few output of the HDSS. When you look at here, the trend of the humidity, temperature, and death pattern, starting from 1998 to 2014, is just a sample of data for you to see. You can see easily that the death curve in blue increase after the temperature and the humidity. So an increase on relative humidity and temperature are followed by high death in the area. And this death affect mostly the children under 5, who are mostly sensitive to climate sensitive diseases like malaria, pneumonia. So this is another output where we have 60 plus, the different age group, and we can see in the 3 age group, with the different age group, that we have 3 peaks of death. April, we have a peak, August and December. And these 3 peaks correspond to the hottest month, which is April. The wettest one is August, and the coolest month is in December. So we also have this heat and rainfall effect on death, where we see that the elderly in Nuna appear to be sensitive to both low and high temperature, with a lag of 0 to 1 degree. As far as the rainfall is concerned, the threshold is 100 millimeters per month, and above this threshold, we have an increase in mortality, overall mortality, and it can reach 7 times higher than the normal one. So these are some data generated from the NUNA HDSS based on the analysis that we did with the population data that we are collecting, matching with weather station data that we have in place. So what is the focus of us? Where are we going? We are trying now to improve the setting, moving from the whole HDSS that we call the HDSS 1.0 to move to the HDSS 2.0, meaning that you have here the community lab, which is the HDSS, the population data that we are collecting, plus the weather station, and we need to add more morbidity data, not only morbidity in terms of collecting information directly by questionnaire and monitoring the health-seeking behavior. We will add some sensor to monitor the health and try to link all to a cloud server where we will have all the data. The metadata will come to this server, the population data will come to this server, also the sensor data monitoring the health will also come to this server to get all the data all in one and ready for analysis. What we call that we want really to get the HDSS ready for climate and health research. So to summarize, I would say that the key benefit of the health and demographic surveillance system is, one, to get an accurate denominator, to capture the changes over time, and to record the timing and sequences of events. So as far as climate change is concerned, there is a great need to get an adequate early warning and a response system for the benefit of the population, and that need to have a good focus on risk prediction, a good system preparedness. I'm thinking about health and food security, and also a performant health system for appropriate response. So for all this, I think there is here a great need to link the health observation data to the population data. And to my view, the HDSS appeared to be really a very good setting for that, to complement all what we are observing from the health. I would like to thank you really for listening.
Thank you, Ali. That was really interesting. Really fantastic to hear about your amazing data and analysis so far. I'm now going to quickly move on to hear from Christine Belasova and Richard Belcher of Imperial College London, who will outline their project plans for child health, climate, and land system change in sub-Saharan Africa study. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. And thank you, Ali, for introducing the NUNA setting. Ali has given you a wonderful overview of the wealth of work that has been done in NUNA. And we thought, well, as people who myself and many of my colleagues have been doing primarily work on climate change and health, now thinking about planetary epidemiology, how can we integrate that and try and look at multiplicative changes, multiplicative impacts of climate change and another planetary boundary, for example, the land system boundary. And in NUNA, I have done work on climate change impacts on crop yield, productivity, and children's mortality and nutritional status, and shown some results. So it seemed to be a low-hanging fruit to try and see how can we integrate the land system change health impacts into this research and look at the two changes simultaneously, so climate change and land system change. So as Ali mentioned, NUNA HDSS functions as an open dynamic cohort. And for the analysis that I've done in the past, which I'll first give you an overview of that, we used the entire cohort from 1992 until 2016. That was the year when we did the analysis. And we used the denominator data. So we knew how many people there were at risk at any point of time. and we used the mortality data, as well as the children's upper arm, middle upper arm circumference data, which is a proxy of children's nutritional status. We're also very fortunate to have data on crop yield productivity throughout this study period, so we're able to relate that to the health outcomes. And so our crop yield productivity data was expressed as a food crop productivity index, which is a composite index indicating how productive were the 5 key crops in this area: millet, maize, rice, fonio, and sorghum, every year over the study period. And we weighted the productivity of each of these crops by the proportion that was harvested in the province, and we created this index, which was expressed in the relative scale. And you can see that from one year to another, there was an appreciable level of variation. So some years were definitely better and others were worse. And typically the worst years were the drought years, or the years when something else occurred, for example, an extensive flooding event. And so we looked at that in relation to health. And to look at crop yield variation in relation to health, we looked at the FCPI, our exposure index, in relation to mortality using survival models, so Kaplan-Meier plots and Cox proportional hazard models. And to look at FCPI in relation to nutritional status, we used multi-level linear regression models. And then also, just to confirm the full pathway, we also related MUAC to survival, which is known in literature to be highly associated. And the models were adjusted for a number of confounders available from the NUNA HDSS system, such as sex, season of birth, ethnicity, religion, mothers and fathers' ability to read, how rural or semi-rural the area of residence was, various infrastructural characteristics, etc. So in that analysis, we found that FCPI was significantly associated with children's survival. So children born in years of good agricultural productivity, the line on the top in the graph, survived better until the age of 5 years than children who were born in years of poorer agricultural productivity. By better and poorer, I mean it's below or above the period average food crop productivity level. So that analysis was done on 21 years of child observations, 44,000 children and 4,500 deaths. Then the other station we were interested in was the food crop productivity and children's nutritional status. And we considered, how does the food crop yield affect children's nutritional status at different points in time? So in the year when the nutritional status measure was measured, and across lifetime, so since the child was born, the average level of crop yield productivity that child has experienced, what effect does that have, and the yield in the year of birth. And yield in the year of measurement and the lifetime average yield were significantly associated with children's nutritional status, so the better the yield, the better the nutrition of children. But the year of birth was unassociated, which made sense to us because MUAC, the nutritional status measure that we used, is very sensitive to short-term changes. So essentially, it reflects how much a child has eaten over the past few weeks. So we expected that final result not to be significant. But then with that in mind, and I must mention to all of that, we also created other studies relating agricultural crop yield productivity to weather fluctuations. I don't have slides just for the sake of time on that, but 70% of all of the variation in crop yield that you can see here was actually attributable to weather variations. And that is going to vary even more in the future, and even more child deaths than we currently see are likely to be attributable to future climate change, even under 1.5 degree scenario, unless there are any major socioeconomic changes. So now the other question is, what is happening with the land systems in Burkina Faso? Here you can see a map of the change in agricultural area in Burkina from 2021 to 2014. And the country has experienced a tremendous expansion of agricultural area. And in fact, it is approaching the limits for further expansion. So by 2030, Burkina Faso will run out of land to expand its agricultural activity. And if you see, the expansion hasn't been the same in different areas of the country. And the Kosi province, where we are doing the work, also in this map over here, has experienced one of the highest rates of expansion. So that's the area which is very close to the limits of further agricultural expansion. So now the question is, how could that affect health? Well, if you expand your agricultural plots, you presumably will be harvesting more crops. Your food availability or income from the sales of harvest may increase. The nutrition subsequently in the family could increase. Your ability to buy healthcare could increase. Education could improve because you can afford it. And hence the survival and nutritional status is likely to improve. So that's one of her hypotheses. On the other hand, if you're losing the agricultural landscape diversity, so let's say you're just expanding everything as a monoculture, you lose trees, you lose shrubs, you only have agricultural land, bare land. That's decreasing biodiversity. And the literature shows that the more you're decreasing your landscape diversity, the less productive your land and plots actually become in the long term. The soil quality degrades because of the more limited nutrient cycling or more homogeneous nutrient cycling. You're also reducing the amount of shade that is available for the farmers to rest in and for the livestock to rest in. So that's likely to negatively impact crop yield. And then following the same story, you would actually have a negative impact. Sorry, I'm kind of talking in the negative terms about the second line, although the slide is actually talking about the positive. So if you increased your landscape diversity, then you would have a positive impact. But obviously, if you're decreasing and then subsequently have a negative impact. And the third hypothesis is that if people start introducing homestead gardens, and there has been in Nuna an actual randomized controlled trial about introducing home gardens, you may be increasing the diversity of agricultural produce that is available to your family. You may be increasing the nutritional quality. You may be increasing the consumption of micronutrients, reducing the non-communicable disease risk in the longer term, but also for children, if the mother is consuming a more diverse, micronutrient-rich diet, that may also improve their health even in the shorter term. So that may have a positive impact on survival. And of course, apart from these three main hypotheses, there are also various factors that could be affected by land systems change, such as mosquito breeding sites and infectious diseases risk, urbanization and its impacts on health, etc. So what we're trying to do in this pilot project, we're trying to come up with exposure metrics for land cover change around where people are, and relate that to our previous analysis by substituting the main exposure, which we used previously, the food crop productivity index, now with this new exposure about the land system change. And we're also interested in looking at land system change as an effect modifier of the association between the food crop productivity and child health. And I'll hand over now to Richard to explain what our new metric of land system change in the setting will be.
Everybody, thank you for the introduction, Christine. So just to explain a little bit about what we're doing. Obviously, the objective here is to identify land use change and places of exposures, as Christine identified, just to represent those exposure pathways that we're talking about. Basically, we have high resolution spatial data to represent pathways more accurately these days, which is great. There've been sort of a number of recent products that have been made available. Here's an example of a few that we'll be working with, so the Google Dynamic World, GLAD cropland change, and their GLAD tree cover data sets. We have a little bit of limitation in our study that we need to align our products with the outcome data that we have. So these products may not cover the study period from 1992 to 2016, which is where we have the outcome data that that Christine explained. Currently in the data exploration phase of the project. So first of all, we're going to ask ourselves how we're going to assess land cover change in the region. Is this changed within the last 2, 3, 4, or 5 years? And that depends on the health pathways that we're looking at. Also, maybe potentially lag change. So historical land use change from previous years might impact health outcomes in the time they're measured. So here's an initial example from the ESA Climate Change Initiative land cover data set. So step one was for us to sort of identify land cover in 2 different years. So in this example, we're looking at 4-year change, that might change in the future. And step 2 was to look at the change trajectories. That's kind of important because these trajectories themselves represent specific processes. So, for example, urbanization or agricultural land expansion into natural areas or vice versa. You can see here on the right panel, you can see change being represented there from cropland to shrubland, and the orange being quite a big change in that part of the region. So what are the limitations with this product for our analysis? Well, the 300-meter resolution we're potentially missing within pixel change, especially within agricultural plots, so like the smaller subsistence farming plots that you have in the region. So, for example, shade trees, which might provide a really important benefit to farmers working on the land. General limitation, I think, with the sort of suite of products that we're looking at, is that older satellites generally don't have as good a spatial resolution, and also more recent products that have managed to go back further, the temporal resolution isn't quite as good, for example, as the ESA Climate Change Initiative land cover. So there's kind of a trade-off there in how we analyze the data. So the next step for us is to sort of approximate land cover change exposures. So we have GPS locations of households. So we were hoping to try and extract sort of change in agricultural plot land cover and change in land cover at home, or proxies for that, essentially. So to do that, first of all, we've managed to source this great data set from NUNA HDSS, which is actually looking at the mean distance from households to agricultural plot. This is a sample of respondents in the survey. It's not the whole survey itself. You can see here, this gives us a good idea of how far people might be walking around the neighbourhood or travelling to get to their agricultural plots, or where they actually are located. So actually, you can actually see in NUNA sometimes the same. So a lot of people here are living right adjacent to the agricultural plots that they have. But also we have got a mean distance of about 2 kilometres with a standard deviation of about 1.7 kilometres. So this gives us a great opportunity to then develop some exposure metrics, which we're going to use, which is sort of circular buffers around where people live, as well as ring buffers potentially too, as proxies for the exposure. And from these, we can generate some change metrics. So linking these metrics with of change with health outcome data from the year, or potentially from the year of birth of the children as well. So the first metric we're looking at is the proportion of change trajectories around where people live. So you can see here an example from one hypothetical household that's in a village. You can see here there's quite a lot of change from cropland to shrubland in the area. Metric 2, we can look at the proportion of land cover at the start year, interacted with the proportion of land cover at the end year. This has the advantage that you can actually sort of quantify the total area rather than just looking at the trajectories, because obviously a change from a very small amount to a little bit more is different from change from a large amount to a lot more, if that makes sense. We're also interested in looking at the change in diversity or heterogeneity indices from start year to the end year, for example, a Shannon index of the land covers. And as part of this research, expert engagement is really, really important. So we've set up a number of meetings with people who are experts in the products that we're using, and also this kind of analysis, so for example, ESA, WRI, and GLAD as well in Maryland. So yeah, any feedback from people here at this forum as well would be greatly appreciated to understand better how we can conceptualize the system and do the analysis. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard, and Christine. Fantastic to hear about your project outline. And I just want to, first of all, invite some comments before we go for further comments from people online. So, Clement, would you like to give some comments from your perspective?
Thank you very much, Sophie, and thanks again all for having me quite special, as I've literally made my first steps in Burkina Faso 40 years ago. Right, it is no surprise, epidemiological studies rely on measurements and observations. From what we've seen, it can be from fixed ground monitors, weather station, which provide limited spatial temporal coverage. It can be from reanalysis of the past, ERA 5 was mentioned, gridded data, which offer long-time series global coverage information to support health assessment regarding, for example, the human exposure to high outdoor air temperature. And it can be from satellite Earth observation product. Land surface temperature have been mentioned, as well as land cover, vegetation, all already explored to a certain extent in the literature. CMIP simulation can also be very useful. They aim to better understand past, present, and future climate change arising from natural and anthropogenic multimodal scenarios context. Listening to the different presentation, I've heard a lot of words like initial conditions, observation, forecast, reanalysis of the past, scenario, early warning system, and then that's a lot of similar vocabulary, similar challenges as in climate science, as in weather prediction. It is all linked. Many scientific communities share similar challenges, issues when it comes to satellite Earth observation. And that's why we should give more strength to interdisciplinary activities, interdisciplinary science, because we can all benefit from the progress of each other. And that would be my main comment this afternoon.
Thanks, Kamal. Yeah, and Weimar, do you want to make a comment?
Yeah, hi, I'm Weimar from Shandong University. I'm very glad to be part of this webinar. First, I want to congratulate on the research achievements from previous speakers. We all know that climate change is the largest public health problem in the new century. Actually, we have also conducted some studies on the relationship between climate change and infectious disease like dengue fever in China. However, many similar studies, including ours, are actually ecological studies, and they share a common problem, which is that the exposure are often measured at the group level, like county or city, rather than individual level. So this is what we call ecological fallacy in epidemiology. For example, sometimes we have to use data from a yearbook to measure land cover. So I think one solution is to use high resolution data such as the ESA Earth observation data. As we have seen a moment ago, the ESA Earth observation data opened a new window to the planetary epidemiology, which can be used to stimulate applied quantitative work to explore past, contemporary, and future population health at scales from local to planetary. I think, as Christine pointed out, new methodological approaches are needed in planetary epidemiology. I think one of the challenges is the high resolution exposure data in this area. I think from the introduction of previous talk, we have learned that the ESA Earth observation data has many advantages. Like, for example, it has, if I remember right, it has 23 climate-related variables, including soil moisture, land cover, fire, etc. I'm also very glad to see the pilot project by Richard and Christine using the ESA Earth observation data. I look forward to seeing more application of this very important data and outcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Really helpful to hear your comments. And finally, Jem Woods, are you able to turn on your microphone?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. And thank you for this opportunity to provide feedback on this really fascinating and quite incredible work with I think very far-reaching potential to link human health with environmental health and to work on one planetary outcomes. And I'm fascinated to see these sort of emerging results so far. I guess I've got some words of caution to contextualize the results and in saying that the results that have just been presented, and in saying that, I'm delighted to see a sort of hypothesis-driven approach, so an experimental approach being applied. And I say that because, for example, the links being made between exposure and primary production, i.e. landscape level production or crop yield production, can be very challenging to tease out in practice. And that's why I say it's fascinating to see these early signals. And so, for example, some of our work on food security and the linkages with energy security, I think are important to consider here. So you in the local context of nutrition and the delivery of nutrition, there may not be an overly strong linkage with direct self-sufficiency in terms of crop production. And so there are potentially strong linkages with imported food, imported not necessarily across national boundaries, but from other regions, and food consumption, and the sort of lags that you showed, I think, Christine, are becoming really quite important. So what are the buffer mechanisms in terms of food security, nutritional delivery, and food security? And then if I come back to the presentation on HDSS, I was really intrigued to see this relationship between, I think it was increasing rainfall and mortality with the 100 mm threshold in rainfall. That struck me as a really interesting threshold to see, because typically you wouldn't see an impact on crop production based on soil moisture levels at anything less than about 300 mm of rain in total for a cropping season. And so I'm fascinated to see that linkage emerging. But overall, I think this is really important work, and thank you very much for presenting it.
Thank you, Jem. And I wondered if Christine, you want to comment back, or if anyone from the floor wants to raise their hand and let us know to make a comment as well.
Yeah, thank you very much for the comments. All very, very helpful and useful. And I think that's an important point, Jem, that you were raising about the food imports. Food imports are happening in Burkina Faso. It was traditionally very much a subsistence farming population, but we do see some increase in rice imports, etc. The way how our earlier analysis of agricultural crop yield variation and health was structured is that we were controlling for an underlying trend line. So let's say if imports are increasing over time, as they kind of tended to do, we are in a way controlling for that trend over time. Not really an ideal way of perhaps controlling for it, and we would need more specific agricultural import data, which isn't really available at the provincial level. But yeah, I acknowledge that limitation, and some further work would need to be done. And of course, that is also a critique to the kind of emergency, as I presented it, of the limits to the expansion of agricultural land. Of course, a lot can also be intensified in Burkina, where agriculture is very, very low intensity and very simple. Would anyone else like to respond or raise questions? We do have one more presentation coming up.
Could I very quickly just respond on that? Because typically what we see in agrarian transitions is you see an interaction between subsistence agriculture, increased wealth development, and access to increased wealth through basic development, and changes in agricultural management practice. And so it may be, or as a hypothesis, you may be seeing the end of subsistence agricultural expansion and the start of the modernization of agricultural practices. But maybe you haven't seen that yet. in which case the dynamic between subsistence agricultural land expansion and expansion of crop production at the intensive margin, you may see that dynamic will change. And so when it comes to projecting, not predicting, but projecting future land use change based on historic extrapolations, then again there needs to be real caution about how you go about doing that.
Yeah, thank you, Jem. And I'd like to, if we have some time, to bring in our colleagues from Nuna, Ali and his colleagues in the room. How much of the intensification in agriculture have you seen locally? Ali, Pascal, Aristide. Yeah, Ali.
Sorry, Christine, I didn't get it. Yeah, I didn't get it. Could you repeat your question?
Yeah, so Jem was just mentioning that we may be seeing an end to subsistence agriculture in Burkina Faso if agriculture expansion can no longer happen and agriculture would need to intensify. So do you see any changes in agricultural practices that would show that the agricultural practices are becoming more intensive as they are in Europe? So using more machinery, inputs, and all of that. Do you see any of these changes already happening in Nuna?
Yes, it is coming, the intensification of the agriculture, but it's still slow. It's slowly going, and most of the people are like slightly moving from the subsistence farming to the commercial crop production. So the issue is that they will leave the food production and going more and more to cotton, and which is really another problem coming with the undernutrition of children as well. And the government itself is like pushing the farmers to intensify the agriculture, to like group them and to subsidize them for intensifying the agriculture. Yeah, this is coming.
That's really interesting that you're getting a movement away from food crops to cotton exports. I wonder if anyone wants to comment on any further. In that case, let's move on to Fred and Elise from the World Resources Institute, who are going to talk more about what you can see from space for land cover monitoring. Thank you.
Thank you. Give me 1 second to share my screen. Where's the Zoom? There's the Zoom. Right, share and make it full screen. You can see it full screen?
Yes, perfect.
All right, well, thank you very much. And it will just be an overview, as Sophie just said, about all the different new technology and new land cover data. And Richard said already a lot, and Clément too. So it's a little bit of a summary, what I would like to give you of all the new and interesting high resolution data we have. Of course, the world is a big place, you know, lots of cover, and remote sensing is one of the only techniques you can actually show on those large planetary scale what's happening. And because our satellites are nowadays so good that it's not only planetary, and we just heard that one of the comments was said, we can actually do it from the local to the planetary scale. And I think that is incredible, exciting for us in the remote sensing side. We also see that, you know, changes in our world are happening, of course, but they're happening faster and faster. And I put a few of those papers out here from 2005 to 2021, and there are some newer papers too, but it's accelerating the change of our world. And if you see the changes are, of course, dynamic. It's not only one way, although one of the biggest way, of course, we know there's lots of deforestation, lots of urbanization, but there's also, you know, forest going to grassland, grassland to cropland, cropland back to forest. Those things do exist. And so this entire world of systems, that is why we're trying to look at as land cover people. And if you see like since the 60s, so 2.5 billion hectares have been changed. If you think about the West, so 13 billion hectares, there is hardly any area that hasn't changed yet, and sometimes on a large scale. So this is for us one of the issues, because we have so much demands on our lands from the Land and Carbon Lab. So we are very afraid that this is happening, that there is so much pressure on lands that, you know, we need to produce more crop, but want to have more nature. We need to have more forest for carbon, but we're cutting forests. So this is for us a big issue, and thinking about how can we make sure our land use is better done than it is now. So we have some great tools for that nowadays, and lots of people talked already about European Space Agency, you know, CCI data, incredible good data. I talk about a few other data sets too. There are a few more, but I hope you get a little bit of flavor of what we all have here. My whole summary of this land data is very good land cover data available now on different parts, on forest, on crop, on trees, on urban. There's lots of good data on change, often nice time series. And I think that's the time series what we all after. Great resolutions from 10 to 30 meters. Yes, there's also data from 500 meter and 1 kilometer and 10 kilometer. Sometimes that's all we have, but a lot of data goes on those 10 and 30 meter resolution. And that, again, you think about from planetary to local scale with that resolution, that's easy. Time frames, the 30 meter often started 2000s, the 10 meter, the Sentinel data in 2016. But again, now we're in 2023, we soon have also 10 years of 10 meter data. And of course, there's a lot of difference in legends. You know, some have very extensive legends, some have short legends, and that depends, of course, on why you want the land cover data. So quickly going to the ESA data, we saw this already. Great time span, 1992 till now. Great legend units. You see a little bit for the legend unit, but it has more than 20 legend units. But it's 300 meter. So, you know, that is a bit of an issue, 300 meter maybe, but it's an incredible long time series. There is a new ESA data, global land cover called World Cover, you know, done by also ESA, came out last year. It's 2020 data. You see there the land cover legend units. It's 10 meter data, the 10 meter around the globe, and they're working on the 2021 data, and then also you might have change. So that is a new data set. There's also another data set, the ESA crop data, serial data set, again, 10 meter, but then only for 2020, only cereals, but again, according to around the whole globe. Another data set that's not from ESA, but it's MapSpap and EarthStats. It uses FAO data, and it's more than 100 crops and yields throughout time, and looking at what are the different crops and what are the increase or decrease in yields. And this is also worked at the moment, so one in development. So that's the ESA data sets, and there are a few other ones, but I just look at the few ones which are mostly used. Another data set that's, you know, is the Global Forest Watch. It's an annual data set, 30 meter global, that's 20 years, but also a weekly alert on 30 and 10 meters, but then only in the tropical. So this is like the data you can see. You see there's a time slider, and any time you're interested, you can see where the changes. I zoomed here on Indonesia. So you can easily see the change. This is from the change from the entire time. And then you can make these trend series. And I think the trend series is one of the most important parts. You can see what's happening on land cover, what's happening on tree cover, what's happening on deforestation. So this looks at just the forest loss. So somehow good news for people like forest, you know, the forest loss is decreasing here in Indonesia, but that time series is very important for us. Then another data set is again the University of Maryland. We talked already about the GLAD lab, you know, is the land cover and land cover change data. Again, it's a 20-year history data, and it has a lot of different data sets in it, as you see on the left side, and you can combine it into one big GLAD cover data sets. And just to see a few of those data, this is 2020, 2000, you know, you don't see much change in this global scale. So therefore I zoom in, but if you see actually the changes that have been there over 20 years. So 800 million hectares of area has changed. And just to look at a few, short vegetation means that savanna grassland, bushlands, you know, all those natural lands has a lot changed to cropland. Forest, of course, has gone a lot to grasslands, grazing, and you have to think about in Latin America that happened a lot. Cropland has gone a lot to build-up area, and that happened a lot in Southeast Asia and especially China. You see an enormous amount of what was before cropland has now been taken over by build-up areas. So you see all those changes happening, in these big data sets, and those are hard changes. Just to zoom in here, a few of those. Here you see some China. The pink is the build-up area, and around it you see a lot of cropland in 2000, and it is 2020. You see the enormous amount of change that happened in this area. Another sign, and this is in Tanzania. Again, the green is the forest, natural vegetation. Yellow is now the crop, and again you see the changes that happening in the world. Enormous amount of crop expansion in this area. You see here the crop expansion. We talked already about it, and it was used in Richard's presentation too, on the cropland. Where's crop stable, where's crop expansion, and where's crop loss? And you see a lot here in the Russia, a lot of crop loss. So actually agricultural land is abandoned. And of course, you see a lot of cropland expansion. You think about the soy in Latin America, and a lot of crop extension in the whole African zone, the dry zone. We talked about it already. Burkina Faso is part of this. There's a lot of increase in population. There needs to be a lot of more food, and so there's a lot of expansion. Unfortunately, we see a lot of the expansion happening in natural lands, and we also see that expansion land usually don't have the biggest yields. It's often a much decreased yields. And it is all from the data. You see here a new data set that's coming up. That's the tree height data. And why is tree height data so important? Because we can make these kind of data. We cannot only look at loss, but also at gain. I zoom here on Central America. So there's Guatemala, Costa Rica. Sorry, I should have told me where I am here. And you see that there is loss and gain, and we see that everywhere. There's somewhere loss and somewhere gain. You see the hotspots where there's a lot of loss, but you also see a hotspot of gain, and that is the new data set we can do with those tree cover gain data that's coming out, hopefully soon. Water extents, we can have seasonal water, monthly water. It's all possible now with the data. Build-up area, I talked about it already. So that is all in that new global land cover data. We also talked a little bit of the dynamic world already. What dynamic world is, it's that every 5 to 10 days you can develop a new data set, because it ingests every ASA data from the Sentinel-2 and directly classifies it. Google with all the power can do that. What you see here is data from an area which is flooded, and you see green land cover, then it's getting dry. And so it looks at grasses, and then the land cover comes back. So it's really a land cover data set. So it shows directly what you can see on the land cover. You see the same here. This is Boston. Red is build-up area. And then purple is snow and ice. And this is just winter. So it just looks at the land cover. So every 5 to 10 days, you can classify. And you see now it's all build-up area. Snow comes in, and this was a big snow storm. Everything is covered by snow. And that is, again, one of the powers of dynamic world. It's a little bit of a different data set than I just told you on the UMD GLAD. This is 10-meter data. The GLAD is 30-meter data, but it's much more, near real time. That's basically the best time to describe that. One more data set I like to present, and that's a tree cover outside forest. There is a lot of trees, and this is a landscape in Kenya. You see a lot of trees, but none of it is forest. This has not qualified by FAO data or ANI data because it's not a forest, but it's just a lot of trees in the forest. This data set on purpose classifies those standing alone trees, so trees in an agriculture area. And that is also a new data set that's called the tropical tree cover, where you can look at all these kind of signatures, and you can see with urban lands or boundary planning, fragmented forest. It's again a different data set. So what I want to basically summarize on all the things, and we heard it from Richard, we heard it from Clément, we heard it from other speakers, there is great data out there on land cover. Sometimes and often longer term, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, high resolution, 10 meter, 30 meter, 300 meter, and classifying all kind of different land covers. and change, and you can so do the trends. And I think for me that is, as a remote sensing person, this is very high interesting, of course. There's also better data. There's the planet data for 5 meter and 10 meter. Those are used a bit ad hoc, although there's more and more happening that you actually can do 5 meter resolution, but it's still a little bit in the research phase. Well, most of this data is just off the shelf. You can get them, you can work with them, as Richard showed on his part. I think for me, that was a quick overview, and I'll give it back to you, Sophie.
Thanks a lot, Fred. And really nice to see the platform that you've got for being able to really quickly visualize things on dynamic world. It's really nice to see. And I wondered, the tropical tree cover, does that cover the area of the study that is being carried out?
Yes, that should be. It should cover all the areas in the tropics from 30 to 30.
Okay, great. And do you know anything about how accurate that is? Is there like documentation available for that one?
There's 2 papers came out. I can send you the papers. The last paper came out 3 weeks ago, maybe a month ago, which goes also on the accuracy of that data.
Great, thank you. So maybe you can post that in the chat.
I will do that.
Thank you. Let's open up the floor a bit more to comments from people online. I can see Gilles got his hand up. Gilles, thanks.
Oops. And I want to apologize in case there's many others that have a lot of questions in the back of their heads, and I want to invite them to bring that forward as well. But just a bit of a broad question. I don't know if maybe Clément is the best person, or Christine or Sophie, or maybe even Fred, to answer it. Let's say I'm a health researcher and I have no experience with Earth observations, but I'm recognizing from the work that I do how critical it is to have that information. What's a good process to work with you guys to connect?
Thanks, Gilles. Let's go to Christine first, as somebody who's in that situation.
Great question. Networking, getting in touch with people, that's the simple way of how to go ahead with it at the moment. In terms of the broader picture and perspective, the World Resource Institute and my former host institution, LSHTM, we had a team who were developing a concept for a planetary health monitoring system called Planetary Health Watch, which would function in a similar way as Resource Watch that Fred was showing, and giving access to different users who want to link spatial data to health data. So it could be decision makers, but also we were considering one user group, researchers. The effort of trying to develop something like that is pretty large. So there's still a funding course to be developed to address that. Something similar or in that direction is emerging from the European Commission, but it's still work in process. So the ideas on how to design that have been published in the Lancet in a comment and in a more detailed report. So I can share that. If anyone is interested in joining, please let me know. Over to the others.
Thanks, Christine. Clément, do you want to make a comment? Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's a very important topic, and my first comment would be to reach out to us, but also to look on the internet. The European Space Agency, but not only, provides a lot of training course and capacity building possibility, and I would encourage all of our project developing satellite-based information. It can be essential climate variables or day-to-day information, to also have a capacity building and training component in their activity. We really need to leverage the use of satellite Earth observation across the world. It should not be seen as a disruptive technology anymore, but as something that is already part of our daily life, even if we do not always notice it.
Thank you. And Fred, do you want to make a comment?
Well, very quickly, I think there's the Global Forest Watch website, which should be user friendly, and everybody can use it and can download the data, etc. But you can also leave a comment there and whatever. But I think for our user community, for our remote sensing community, and especially for Clément, I think too, like, we would love to answer your question. getting our data used is the best complement. It's like we are not same as I think, Klima, we're not a research organization or primary research organization. Our organization is to get this data used. So yes, we have hopefully very user-friendly tools that you can do it yourself if you want, not for all data sets. But for other data sets, we would love to work with you. I think that is part of what we think, and I think why we are in remote sensing, because we think it helps to resolve a lot of our thinking. And so in that sense, we're all very happy to help. Of course, there's limited time for everybody, but I think that's partly our issues.
Absolutely. Thank you, Fred. And Gilles, I think you've also made a step towards helping people connect and ask questions across these different communities. You've set up a member portal group, and maybe you can repost the link in the chat for people that want to join that group. It's an open invitation. You just sign up for the member portal. It's completely free, and join the network for this Future Earth community. Does anyone else want to ask a question? I can't see any questions in the chat. We're coming up to the hour now, and so I think it just remains to say thank you so much for the speakers, for your fantastic presentations, and thank you for joining this webinar. It's been really great 2 hours, and yeah, take care everyone, and enjoy the research.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.